3. A Bracelet of Bruges. The bracelet had fallen into the canal, and the fact that the canal was the most picturesque canal in the old Flemish city of Bruges, and that the ripples caused by the splash of the bracelet had disturbed reflections of wondrous belfries, towers, steeples, and other unique examples of Gothic architecture. It did nothing whatsoever to assuage the sudden agony of the disappearance. For the bracelet had been given to Katie Santoris by her gracious and lordly manager, Lionel Belmont, from the United States, upon the completion of an unexampled run of the Delmonico doll at the Regency Theatre in London, and its diamonds were worth £500, to say nothing of the gold. The beautiful Kitty and her friend Eve Fincastle, the journalist, having exhausted Ostend, and the jewelry arrived in Bruges in the course of their holiday tour, the question of Kitty's jewelry had arisen at the start. Kitty had insisted that she must travel with all her jewels, according to the custom of theatrical stars of great magnitude. Eve had equally insisted that Kitty must travel without jewels, and had exhorted her to remember the days of her simplicity. They compromised. Kitty was allowed to bring the bracelet, but nothing else save the usual half-dozen rings. The ravishing creature could not have persuaded herself to leave the bracelet behind, because it was so recent a gift and still new and strange and heavenly to her. But since prudence forbade even Kitty to let the trifle lie about in the hotel bedrooms, she was obliged always to wear it. And she had been wearing it on this bright afternoon in early October, when the girls, during a stroll, had met one of their new friends, Madame Lawrence, at the world-famous Croix de Rosière, just as the back of the Hotel de Ville in the Halles. Madame Lawrence resided permanently in Bruges. She was between 25 and 45, dark, with an air of continually subduing and natural instinct to dash, and well dressed in black. Equally interested in the patronage of the poor, she had made the acquaintance of Eve and Kitty at the Hotel de la Grande Place, where she called from time to time to introduce English travelers to buy genuine Bruges lace, wrought under her own supervision by her own paupers. She was Belgian by birth, but when complimented on her fluent and correct English, she gave all the praise to her deceased husband, an English barrister. She had settled in Bruges like many people settle there, because Bruges is inexpensive, picturesque, and inordinately respectable. Besides, an English church and chaplain, it has 2 cathedrals, an episcopal palace with a real bishop in it. "What an exquisite bracelet! May I look at it?" It was these simple but ecstatic words spoken by Madame Lawrence, charming foreign accent, which had begun the tragedy. The 3 women had stopped to admire the always admirable view from the little quay, and they were leaning over the rails when Kitty unclasped the bracelet for the inspection of the widow. The next instant there was a pop, an affrighted exclamation from Madame Lawrence and her native tongue, and the bracelet was engulfed before the very eyes of all 3. The 3 looked at each other, nonplussed. Then they looked around, but not a single person was in sight. Then, for some reason which doubtless psychology can explain, they hard stared at the water. Through the water there was just as black and foul as it was everywhere else in the canal system of Bruges. "Surely you've not dropped it?" Eve Fincastle exclaimed in a voice of horror, yet she knew positively that Madame Lawrence had. The delinquent took a handkerchief from her mouth and sobbed into it. And between her sobs she murmured, "We must inform the police." "Yes, of course," said Kitty, with the lightness of one to whom a £500 bracelet was bagatelle. "They'll fish it up in no time." Well, Eve decided, you go to the police at once, Kitty, and Madame Lawrence will go with you because she speaks French, and I'll stay here to mark the exact spot. The other two started, but Madame Lawrence, after a few steps, put her hand to her side. I can't, she sighed, pale. I am too upset. I cannot walk. You go with Miss Utterings, she said to Eve, and I will stay. Then she leaned heavily against the railings. Eve and Kitty ran off just as if it were an affair of seconds, and the bracelet had to be saved from drowning. But they had scarcely turned the corner 30 yards away when they reappeared in the company of a high official of the police whom, by the most lucky chance in the world, they had encountered in a covered passage leading to the Palace de Bruges. Enslaved by Kitty's beauty, proved to be the very mirror of politeness and optimism. He took their names and addresses and a full description of the bracelet, and informed them that the place canal was 9 feet deep, and he said that the bracelet should undoubtedly be discovered on the morrow, but that, as dusk was imminent, it was futile to commence angling that night. In the meantime, the loss should be kept secret, and to make all sure, a succession of gendarmes should guard the spot during the night. Kitty grew radiant and rewarded the gallant offer with smiles. Eve was satisfied, and the face of Madame Lawrence wore a less mournful hue. And now, said Kitty to Madame, when everything had been arranged, and the first of the gendarmes was duly installed at the exact spot against the railings, you must come and take tea with us in our winter garden, and be gay. Smile, I insist, and I insist that you don't worry. Madame Lawrence tried feebly to smile. You are good-natured, she stammered, which was decidedly true. 2. The winter garden of the Hotel de la Grande Place, referred to in all the hotel's advertisements, was merely the inner court of the hotel, roofed by glass, at the height of the first story. Cane flourished there in the shape of lounge chairs, but no other plant. One of the lounge chairs was occupied when, just as a carillon in the belfry at the other end of the place began to play Glenad's Nazareth, indicating the hour of 5 o'clock. The 3 ladies entered the winter garden. Apparently, the toilets of 2 of them had been adjusted and embellished, as for what somewhat ceremonious occasion. "Oh," cried Kitty Santoris, when she perceived the occupant of the chair, "a millionaire! Mr. Thorold, how charming of you to reappear like this! I invite you to tea." Cecil Thorold rose with the appropriate eagerness. "Delighted," he said, smiling, and then explained that he had arrived in Ostend about 2 hours before and had taken rooms in the hotel. "You knew we were staying here?" Eve asked as she shook hands with him. "No," he replied, "but I am very glad to find you again." "Are you?" she said languidly, but her color heightened, and those eyes of hers sparkled. "Madame Lawrence," Kitty chirped, "let me present Mr. Cecil Thorold. He is appallingly rich, but we mustn't let that frighten us." From a mouth less adorable than the mouth of Miss Santoris, such an introduction might have been judging, lacking the elements of good form. But for more than 2 years now, Kitty has known that whatever she did or said was perfectly correct because she did or said it. The new acquaintances laughed amiably, and a certain intimacy was at once established. "Shall I order tea, dear?" Eve suggested. "No, dear," said Kitty quietly. "We will wait for the Count." "The Count?" demanded Cecil Thorold. "The Comte d'Avric," Kitty explained. "He is staying here." "A French nobleman, no doubt?" "Yes," said Kitty, and she added, "You will like him. He is an archaeologist and a musician. Oh, and lots of things." If I am 1 minute late, I entered pardon, fine tenor voice at the door. It was the Count. After he had been introduced to Madame Lawrence and Cecil Thorold had been introduced to him, tea was served. Now, the Comte d'Avric was everything that a rich count ought to be. As dark as Cecil Thorold, and even handsomer. He was a little older and a little taller than the millionaire, and a short, pointed black beard, exquisitely trimmed, gave him the appearance of a staid reliability which Cecil lacked. His bow was a vertebrate poem, his smile a consolation for all misfortunes, and he had managed his hat, stick, gloves, and cup with dazzling assurance of a conjurer. To observe him at afternoon tea was to be convinced that he had been specially created to shine gloriously in drawing-rooms, winter gardens, and tables d'hôte. He was one of those men who always do the right thing at the right moment, or are capable of speaking an infinite number of languages with absolute purity of accent. He spoke English much better than Madame Lawrence, and who can do and discourse with fervour and accuracy on all sciences, arts, sports, and religions. In short, he was a phoenix of a count, and this was certainly the opinion of Miss Kitty Satyrus and of Miss Eve Fincastle, both of whom reckoned that what they did not know about men might be ignored. Kitty and the Count, it soon became evident, were mutually attracted. Their souls were approaching each other with a velocity which increased inversely as the square of the lessening distance between them, and Eve was watching this approximation with undisguised interest and relish. Nothing of the least importance occurred, save the Count's marvelous exhibition of how to behave at afternoon tea, until the reflection was nearly over. And then, during a brief pause in the talk, Cecil, who was sitting to the left of Madame Lawrence, looked sharply around at the right shoulder of his tweed coat. He repeated this gesture a second, and yet a third time. "What's the matter with the man?" asked Eve Fincastle. Both she and Kitty were extremely bright, animated, and even excited. "Nothing. I thought I saw something on my shoulder, that's all," said Cecil. "Ah, it is only a bit of thread," and he picked off the thread with his left hand and held it before Madame Lawrence. "See, it's a thin piece of black silk, knotted. At first I took it for an insect. You know how the queer things look out of the corner of your eye. Pardon. I dropped the fragment onto Madame Lawrence's black silk dress. Oh, now it's lost." "If you will excuse me, kind friends," said Madame Lawrence, "I will go." She spoke hurriedly, and as though in mental distress. "Poor thing," Kitty Satyrus exclaimed when the widow had gone. "She's still dreadfully upset, and Kitty and Eve proceeded jointly to relate the story of the diamond bracelet, which upon hereto they had kept silence, though with difficulty, out of regard for Madame Lawrence's feelings. Cecil made no comment. The Count, with the sympathetic excitability of his race, walked up and down the winter garden, asserting earnestly that such clumsiness amounted to a crime, when he grew calm and confessed that he shared the optimism of the police as to the recovery of the bracelet. Lastly, he complimented Kitty on her equitable demeanor under this affliction. "Do you know, Count," said Cecil Thorold, after they had all four ascended to the drawing-room overlooking the grand place, "I was quite surprised when I saw that at tea you had not had to be introduced to Madame Lawrence." "Why is that, dear Mr. Thorold?" the Count inquired suavely. "Oh, I thought you had seen the register in Ostend a few days ago." The Count shook his wonderful head. "Perhaps you have a brother," Cecil paused. "No," said the Count, "but it is a favorite theory of mine that everyone has his double somewhere in the world." Previously, the Count had been discussing planchettes. He was a great authority of the supernatural, the subconscious, and the subliminal. Now he deviated gracefully to the discussion of the theory of doubles. "I suppose you aren't going out for the walk, dear, before dinner?" Eve said to Kitty. No, dear. I think I shall, said Eve, and her glance to Cecil Thorold intimidated in the plainest possible manner that she wished not only to have a companion for her stroll, but to leave Kitty and the Count in dual solitude. I shouldn't if I were you, Miss Fincastle, Cecil remarked with his calm and steady blandness. It's risky here in the evenings, with these canals exhaling miasma and mosquitoes and bracelets and all sorts of things. I will take the risk, thank you, said Eve with an icy tone, and she haughtily departed. She could not cower before Cecil's millions. As for Cecil, he joined in the discussion of the theory of doubles. Part 3. On the next afternoon, but one policeman were still fishing without success for the bracelet and raising the ancient duck's long-buried odors which threatened to destroy the inhabitants of the quay. When Kitty Sartoris had hinted that perhaps the authorities might see their way to drawing off the water from the canal, the authorities had intimated that the death rate of Bruges has already been high as convenient. Nevertheless, though nothing had happened, the situation had somehow developed, and in such a manner that the bracelet itself was in danger of being partially forgotten. And of all places in Bruges, the situation had developed on the top of the renowned belfry which dominates the Grand Place, in particular, and in the city in general. The summit of the belfry is 355 feet high, and it is reached by 402 winding stone steps, each a separate menace to life and limb. Eve Fincastle had climbed those steps alone, perhaps in a quest of view of the top, perhaps in quest of spiritual calm. She had not been leaning over the parapet more than a minute before Cecil Thorold had appeared, his field glasses slung over his shoulder. They began to talk a little, and nervously, and only in snatches. The wind blew free up there among the The Count is a most charming man, Eve said, as if in defense of the Count. He is, said Cecil. I agree with you. Oh, no, you don't, Mr. Thorold. Oh, no, you don't. Then there was a pause, and the twain looked down upon the Bruges, and its venerable streets, and its grass-grown squares, its waterways, and its innumerable monuments spread out like a map-like beneath them in the mellow October sunshine. Citizens passed along the thoroughfare in the semblance of tiny dwarfs. If you didn't hate him, said Eve, you wouldn't behave as you do. How do I behave, then? Eve schooled her voice in an imitation of jocularity. Oh, Tuesday evening and all day yesterday you couldn't leave them alone. You know you couldn't. 5 minutes later, the conversation had shifted. You actually saw the bracelet fall into the canal, said Cecil. I actually saw the bracelet fall into the canal, and no one could have got it out while Kitty and I were away, because we weren't away more than half a minute. And they could not dismiss the subject of the Count, and presently he was the topic again. Naturally, it would be a good match for the Count for any man, said Eve, but then it would only be a good match for Kitty. Of course, he is not so rich as some people, but he is rich. Cecil examined the horizon with his glasses, and then the streets near the Grand Place. Rich, is he? I'm glad for it. By the by, he's gone to Ghent for the day, hasn't he? Yes, he went by the 9:27. He returns by the 4:38. There was another pause. Well, said Cecil at length, handing the glasses to Eve Fincastle, kindly glance down there. Follow the line to the Rue St. Nicholas. You see the cream-colored house with the enclosed courtyard. Now, do you see two figures standing together near the door, a man and a woman? The woman on the steps. Who are they? I can't see very well, said Eve. Oh, yes, my dear lady, you can, said Cecil. These glasses are the very best. Try again. They look like Count d'Averic and Madame Lawrence, Eve murmured. But the Count is on his way to Ghent. I see the steam from 438 over there. The curious thing is that Count entered the house of Madame Lawrence, to whom he was introduced for the first time the day before yesterday at 10 o'clock this morning. Yes, it could be a very good match for the Count, when one comes to think of it, and it usually is that sort of man who contrives to marry a brilliant and successful actress. There, he's just leaving, isn't he? Now let's descend and listen to the recital of his day's doings in Ghent, shall we? You mean to insinuate, Eve burst out with sudden wrath, that the Count is an adventurer, and that Madame Lawrence... Oh, Mr. Thorold! She laughed condescendingly. This joke is too absurd. Do you suppose I haven't noticed how impressed you were with Kitty in the Devonshire mansion that night, and again in Onstead, and again here? You're simply carried away by jealousy. Do you think you became here you are a millionaire, you must have all you want? I haven't the slightest doubt that the Count... Anyhow, said Cecil, let us go down and hear about Ghent. His eyes made the number of remarks, indulgent, angry, amused, protective, admiring, persuasive, and puzzled, too subtle for the medium of words. They groped their way down to earth in silence, and it was in silence they crossed the Grand Place. The Count was seated on the terrace in front of the hotel with a liquor glass before him, and he was making graceful and expressive signs to Kitty Sartoris, who leaned her marvelous beauty out of the first-story window. He greeted Cecil Thorold and Eve with an equal glance. How was Ghent? Cecil inquired. Did you go to Ghent, after all, Count? Eve put in. The Comte d'Arvent looked from one to the other, then, instead of replying, he sipped his glass. No, he said, I didn't go. A rather curious fact is that I happened to meet Madame Lawrence, who offered to show me her collection of lace. I've been an amateur of lace for some years, and Madame Lawrence's collection is amazing. You have to see it. No, you should go. I'm afraid I've spent much of the day there. When the Count had gone to join Kitty in the drawing room, Eve Fincastle looked victoriously at Cecil, as if to demand of him, Will you apologize? My dear journalist, Cecil remarked, you gave the show away. That evening, in the continued obstinacy of the bracelet, which still refused to be caught, began at last to disturb the bird-like mind of Kitty Sartoris. Moreover, the secret was out, and while the whole town of Bruges was discussing the episode and the chances of success. Let us consult Planchette, said the Count. His proposal was received with enthusiasm by Kitty. Eve had disappeared. Planchette was produced, and when asked if the bracelet would be recovered, it wrote under the hands of Kitty and Count a trembling yes. When asked by whom, it wrote a word which faintly resembled Averic. The Count stated that he should personally commence dragging operations at sunrise. We'll see, he said. I shall succeed. Let me try this toy, may I? Cecil asked blandly, and upon Kitty agreeing, he addressed Planchette in a clear voice. Now, Planchette, who will restore the bracelet to its owner? The Planchette wrote Thorold, but in characters as firm and regular as those as a copybook. Mr. Thorold is laughing at us, observed the Count. Imperturbably bland. Oh, how horrible you are, Mr. Thorold. 4. Of the 4 persons more or less interested in the affair, 3 were secretly active that night, in and out of the hotel. Only Kitty Sartoris, chief mourner of the bracelet, slept placidly in her bed. It was towards 3 o'clock in the morning that a sort of preliminary crisis was reached. From the multiplicity of doors which ventilate its rooms, one would imagine that the average foreign hotel must have been designed immediately after its architect had been to the Paris Royal farce, in which every room opens into every other room in every act. The Hotel de la Grande Place was not particularly in this respect. It abounded in doors. All the chambers on the second story over the public rooms fronting place communicated one with the next, but naturally most of the communicating doors were locked. Cecil Thorold and the Comtes d'Arec had each a bedroom and a sitting room on that floor. The Count's sitting room adjoined Cecil's, and the door between was locked, and the key was in the possession of the landlord. Nevertheless, at 3 a.m. this particular door opened noiselessly from Cecil's side, and Cecil entered the domain of the Count. The moon shone, and Cecil could plainly see not only the silhouette of the belfry across the place, but also the principal objects within the room. He noticed the table in the middle, the large easy-chair turned towards the hearth, the old-fashioned sofa, but not a single article did he perceive which might have been the personal property of the Count. He cautiously passed across the room through the moonlight to the door of the Count's bedroom, which apparently, to his immense surprise, was not only shut, but locked, and the key in the lock on the sitting-room side. Silently unlocking it, he entered the bedroom and disappeared. In less than 5 minutes he crept back into the Count's sitting room, closed the door, and locked it. Odd, he murmured reflectively, but he seemed quite happy. There was a sudden movement in the region of the hearth, and a form rose from the armchair. Cecil rushed to the switch and turned on the electric light. Eve Fincastle stood before him. They faced each other. What are you doing here this time, Miss Fincastle? He asked sternly. You can talk freely. The Count will not waken. I may ask you the same question, Eve replied with a cold bitterness. Excuse me, you may not. You are a woman. This is the Count's room. You are in error, she interrupted him. This is not the Count's room. It is mine. Last night I told the Count that I had some important writing to do, and I asked him as a favor to relinquish this room to me for 24 hours. He very kindly consented. He removed his belongings, handed me the key to the door, and the transfer was made in the hotel books. And now, she added, may I inquire, Mr. Thorold, what you are doing in my room? I thought it was the Count's, Cecil faltered, decidedly at a loss for the moment. In offering my humblest apologies, permit me to say that I admire you, Miss Fincastle. I wish I could return the compliments, Eve exclaimed, as she repeatedly, with an almost plaintive sincerity, I do wish I could. Cecil raised his arms and let them fall to his sides. You meant to catch me, he said. You suspected something, then? The important writing was an invention? And he added with a faint smile, you really ought not to have fallen asleep. Suppose I had not wakened you. Please don't laugh, Mr. Thorold. Yes, I did suspect. There was something in the demeanor of your servant Lecky that gave me the idea. I didn't mean to catch you. Why, you, a millionaire, should be a burglar, I cannot understand. I never understood that incident in the Devonshire mansion. It was beyond me. I am by no means sure that you didn't have a great deal to do with the Rainshire affair at Ostend. But that you should have stooped to slander is the worst. I confess you are a mystery. I confess that I can make no guess at the nature of your present scheme, and what I shall do now I have caught you. I don't know. I can't decide. I think I must. If, however, anything is missing tomorrow morning, I shall be bound by any case to denounce you. Do you grasp that? I grasp it perfectly, my dear journalist, Cecil replied, and something will not improbably be missing. But take the advice of a burglar and a mystery, and go to bed. It's 3:30. And Eve went, and Cecil bowed her out, and then returned to his own rooms. The Count's apartment was left to the moonlight. Planchet is a very safe prophet, said Cecil to Kitty Centaurus the next morning, provided it has a firm guidance. We there were at breakfast. What do you mean? I mean that Planchet prophesied last night that I should restore you to your bracelet, and I do. I took the lovely giffa from the pocket and handed it to Kitty. How did you find it, dear thing? Kitty stammered, trembling under a shock of joy. I fished it up out of the mire by a contrivance of my own. But when? Oh, very early, at 3 o'clock a.m., you see. I was determined to be the first. In the dark, then? Why, I had a light. Don't you think I'm rather clever? Kitty's scene of ecstatic gratitude does not come into the story. Suffice it to say that not only until the moment of its restoration did she realize how precious the bracelet was to her. It was 10 o'clock before Eve descended. She had breakfast in her room, and Kitty had already exhibited to her the prodigal bracelet. I particularly want you to go up to the belfry with me, Miss Fincastle, Cecil greeted her, and his tone was so serious and urgent that she consented. They left Kitty playing waltzes on the piano in the drawing room. And now, O man of mystery, Eve questioned when they had toiled to the summit, and they saw the city as the dwarfs beneath them. We are in no danger of being disturbed here, Cecil said, but I will make my explanation, the explanation which I certainly owe you, as brief as possible. Your Comte d'Avric is an adventurer, please don't be angry, and your Madame Lawrence is an adventuress. I knew that I had seen them together. They work in concert, and for the most part make a living in the gambling tables of Europe. Madame Lawrence was expelled from Monte Carlo last year for being too intimate with a croupier. You may be aware that at a roulette table one can do a great deal with the aid of the croupier. Madame Lawrence appropriated the bracelet on her own, as it were. The Count, he may be a real Count for anything I know, heard first of the enterprise from the lips of Miss Sartoris. He was worried, angry, because he was really a little in love with your friend, and he saw golden prospects. It is just the fact, the Count's genuine passion for Miss Sartoris, that renders the case psychologically interesting. To proceed, Madame Lawrence became jealous. The Count spent 6 hours yesterday in trying to get the bracelet from her, and failed. He tried again last night, and succeeded, but not easily, for he did not re-enter the hotel until after 1 o'clock. At first I thought he had succeeded in the daytime, and I had arranged accordingly, for I did not see why he should have the honor and glory of restoring the bracelets to its owner. Lecky and I fixed up a sleeping draught for him. The minor details were simple. When you caught me this morning, the bracelet would be in my pocket, and instead I had left the brief note in the personal of the Count, which has had the singular effect of inducing him to decamp. Probably he has not gone alone, but isn't it amusing that, since you so elaborately took his sitting room, he will be convinced that you are the party of his undoing, you, his staunchest defender? Eve's face gradually broke into an embarrassed smile. You haven't explained, she said, how Madame Lawrence got the bracelet. Come over here, Cecil answered. Take these glasses and look down at the Quai de Rosée. You see everything plainly. Eve could, in fact, see on the quay a little mound in the mud which had been extracted from the canal in the quest for the bracelet. Cecil continued. On my arrival at Bruges on Monday, I had a fancy to climb the belfry at once. I witnessed the whole scene between you and Miss Sartoris and Madame Lawrence through my glasses. Immediately your backs were turned, Madame Lawrence had her hands behind her, and her back against the railing, and began to make a sort of rapid drawing-up motion with her forearms. Then I saw a momentary glitter. Considerably mystified, I visited the spot after you had left and chatted with the guardian on duty and got round him, and then it dawned on me that the robbery had been planned, prepared, and executed with extraordinary originality and ingenuity. A long, thin thread of black silk must have been readily tied to the railing, with perhaps a hook in the other end. As soon as Madame Lawrence held the bracelet, she attached the hook to it and dropped it. The silk, especially as it was the last thing in the world you would look for, was as good as invisible. When you went for the police, Madame had retrieved the bracelet, hid it in her muff, and had broke off the silk. Only in her haste she left a bit of the silk tied to the railing. That fragment I carried to the hotel. All along she must have been a little uneasy about me, and that's all. Except that I wonder you thought I was jealous of the Count's intentions to your friend. He gazed at her admiringly. I'm glad that you are not the thief, Mr. Thorold, said Eve. Well, Cecil said, as for that, I've left him a couple of louis de fraise, and I shall pay for his hotel bill. Why? There were notes for nearly 10,000 francs with the bracelet. Ill-gotten gains, I'm sure. A trifle, but only reward I shall have for my trouble. I shall put them to good use. He laughed. Sincerely, Gang.